What if admitting that you know nothing was, in fact, the greatest sign of intelligence? This phrase has crossed centuries because it strikes a sensitive point, the illusion that knowing is the same as repeating. The man behind this idea lived in a city where everyone had opinions about everything. Politics, justice, virtue, truth. He wrote no books, did not call himself a master, and did not offer ready-made answers. What he did was simple and uncomfortable. He asked questions. These questions exposed fragile certainties, dismantled false wisdoms, and forced people to think about themselves. That is why his way of thinking changed philosophy, education, and the way we understand knowledge to this day. In this video, you will discover who this man was, why his method bothered so many people, and what he still has to teach in a world full of quick answers. Socrates was born around 469 BC in ancient Athens, a city in political, cultural, and intellectual turmoil. Democracy under test, constant wars, intense public debates. Here, Greek philosophy begins to replace mythical explanations with reason. And Socrates grows up precisely in this cauldron. Son of a sculptor and a midwife, far from the elite, he inherits neither power nor prestige. He inherits observation. While Athens values appearance, status, and beautiful speeches, Socrates begins to distrust those who claim to know too much. He observes politicians, poets, and teachers speaking with confidence, but without depth. The question starts to trouble him: is knowledge really what these people say they have? This restlessness will shape everything: his view of truth, ethics, and wisdom. Unlike traditional philosophers, Socrates does not write, does not found a school, and does not charge to teach. His space is the street. His method is dialogue. His weapon is questioning. He provokes not to win debates, but to reveal contradictions. And it is in this Athenian environment, free, noisy, and conflict-ridden, that something dangerous is born, the habit of thinking. But how does a simple citizen, without books and without official positions, go from a silent observer to someone who disturbs an entire city? That is where Athens ceases to be just a setting and becomes an intellectual battlefield. Ancient Athens was not just a city. It was a living experiment. Direct democracy, public courts, open assemblies. Every citizen spoke, gave opinions, judged. This created something explosive: conflict of ideas in the public square. It is in this environment that classical philosophy stops being distant theory and becomes everyday practice. Thinking becomes a political act. Before this, the world was explained by the gods. Lightning, destiny, morality, everything came from myth. But Athens begins to demand something else: reason. An uncomfortable question arises: why? And when someone asks why, too much, Greek philosophy is born. Not as a school discipline, but as a direct confrontation between opinions, interests, and competing truths. It is in this scenario that Socrates fits like a glove, or like a problem. While sophists taught persuasive speeches in exchange for money, he questioned whether persuading was the same as knowing. Athens valued those who spoke beautifully. Socrates valued those who thought correctly. The clash was inevitable. The city produced leaders, judges, and generals, but rarely stopped to ask, what is justice? What is virtue? What is living well? And when these questions begin to circulate, something changes. Philosophy stops explaining the cosmos and starts examining the human being. The focus leaves the sky and falls directly on conscience. Athens creates the stage. Socrates enters the scene. And from here on, philosophy will no longer be about ready-made answers, but about the discomfort of not knowing. But where does this Socratic obsession with dismantling certainties come from? It all begins with a simple and deeply dangerous phrase. The phrase, "I know that I know nothing," attributed to Socrates, is not a confession of ordinary ignorance. It is a direct attack on false wisdom. In Athens, everyone claimed to know. Politicians about justice, poets about truth, teachers about virtue. Socrates does the opposite. He starts from zero. Why? Because those who think they already know stop thinking. Here comes the turning point of Greek philosophy, recognizing limits as the starting point of knowledge. This is conscious ignorance. It is not a lack of information, it is intellectual humility. Socrates realizes that most people confuse opinion with truth. He does not place himself above others. He places himself in doubt, and this doubt is deeply rational. By saying that he knows nothing, he opens space for real questioning, without dogmas, without memorized speeches, just reason in motion. This stance becomes the heart of the Socratic method, asking questions until certainties collapse, not to humiliate, but to clear the ground of thought. The result? General discomfort. Because admitting that you do not know requires self-knowledge. It requires ethics. It requires courage. It is easier to appear wise than to be honest with oneself. And it is exactly here that Socrates separates those who seek truth from those who seek only applause. But if recognizing one's own ignorance is the first step, what comes next? This is where ignorance stops being a weakness and becomes philosophical strength. For Socrates, admitting one's own ignorance was not defeat. It was method. Conscious ignorance arises when an individual realizes that they know less than they imagine, and this changes everything, because from that point on, thinking stops being defensive and becomes investigative. Those who accept that they do not know finally begin to learn. In ancient Athens, this sounded almost offensive. The city rewarded confidence, rhetoric, and the appearance of wisdom. Socrates goes against the current. The more someone claims to know, the more he distrusts them. The question is simple and cruel. Are you sure about what you're saying? And almost always, the answer collapses. Not because of a lack of intelligence, but because of an excess of certainty. This posture requires intellectual humility, recognizing limits in the face of truth. It is not submission, it is rational honesty. Socrates believed that the greatest obstacle to knowledge is not common ignorance, but the illusion of knowing. It is this illusion that blocks critical thinking, prevents self-knowledge, and corrupts ethics. By assuming his own ignorance, Socrates places himself on equal footing in dialogue. He does not teach like a traditional master. He investigates together. Conversation becomes a tool, error becomes a step, doubt becomes the engine, and this transforms ignorance into something active, productive, almost revolutionary. But if admitting that you do not know is already a step forward, why do so many people prefer to pretend that they know? This is where the conflict between true wisdom and false wisdom comes in, the kind that only appears deep. For Socrates, not all wisdom is real. In ancient Athens, there was an excess of intelligent people, and very few wise ones. Politicians spoke with confidence, poets enchanted crowds, teachers taught techniques. But when questioned deeply, many could not explain what they claimed. Socrates realizes something crucial. False wisdom is recognized by absolute certainty. True wisdom, for him, is not about accumulating answers, but about knowing how to examine ideas. Those who believe they know everything do not investigate, do not listen, do not revise. The wise, on the other hand, accept limits, practice intellectual humility, and keep reason in constant motion. This difference is subtle, but decisive. One speaks to appear intelligent, the other asks to get closer to the truth. Socrates exposes this false wisdom through dialogue. He does not accuse, he simply asks. And question after question, it becomes clear who masters a speech and who masters a concept. The clash is inevitable because no one likes to discover that their certainties are fragile. False wisdom protects the ego. True wisdom challenges thought. This distinction shifts the focus of Greek philosophy. It is not enough to appear wise in front of others. One must be coherent with oneself. And it is precisely this coherence that prepares the ground for the next step of Socratic thought, an entire method based on the art of questioning. The Socratic method is born from Socrates' everyday practice in the streets of Athens, not as abstract theory, but as a direct confrontation of ideas. It begins simply, one question, then another, and another. Each answer is tested, refined, or dismantled. There is no personal attack, only logical questioning. The target is never the person, it is the idea. The strength of the method lies in the sequence. Socrates leads the interlocutor to perceive internal contradictions, limits of their own argument, gaps hidden beneath beautiful speeches. Reason does the heavy work. The process does not deliver ready-made answers. It forces the other to think. It is uncomfortable, but effective. Those who go through it rarely leave unchanged. This method turns dialogue into a tool of investigation. Instead of teaching content, Socrates teaches how to examine concepts such as justice, virtue, and knowledge. Learning happens when certainty falls. That is why the Socratic method does not seek to win debates, but to produce clarity. It is not rhetoric. It is analysis. By placing questions at the center, Socrates inaugurates an essential practice of classical philosophy. Thinking requires an honest confrontation with one's own mind. And when an answer can no longer sustain itself, the next step emerges, not to destroy ideas, but to help them be born. This is where questioning becomes something even deeper. Maiutics is the most refined stage of Socrates' thought. The name is no coincidence. It comes from his mother's profession, a midwife. Just as she helped give birth to children, Socrates believed he helped give birth to ideas. He did not place knowledge into another's mind. He helped the other bring to the surface what was already there, confused, misshapen, or hidden. After dismantling certainties through the Socratic method, he guided the dialogue toward reconstruction. Question after question, the interlocutor reorganizes their own thinking, corrects errors, and approaches more solid definitions. Learning does not come from outside. It is born from within. This makes knowledge more lasting and more honest. Maiutics requires active participation. There is no passive spectator. Thinking is work. That is why Socrates did not please everyone. He demanded reason, attention, and a willingness to revise beliefs. This process strengthens self-knowledge and prevents dependence on intellectual authorities. The individual becomes responsible for what they think. With this, Greek philosophy makes it clear that teaching is not transferring knowledge, but provoking consciousness. And when ideas begin to be born in this way, teaching ceases to be mere discourse and becomes a direct human relationship. It is at this point that dialogue is consolidated as the main Socratic educational tool. For Socrates, teaching was not about speaking alone. It was about thinking together. Dialogue replaces the lecture because it forces two minds to move. There is no passive audience, nor absolute authority. There is exchange, confrontation, and constant adjustment of ideas. Learning happens in the middle of the conversation, not at its end. In ancient Athens, this was revolutionary. Traditional teaching valued long, impressive speeches. Socrates does the opposite. Short statements, precise questions, strategic silence. He listens as much as he speaks. Each answer from the other defines the next step of the questioning. The path to knowledge is not predefined. It is built in real time. Dialogue forces clarity. Those who do not understand contradict themselves. Those who think poorly stumble over their own words. That is why conversation becomes a method of philosophical investigation. Reason manifests itself in the respectful confrontation of ideas, and truth emerges not from imposition, but from coherence. This model creates thinkers, not repeaters. It forms individuals capable of sustaining arguments, revising beliefs, and exercising critical thinking. And when someone learns to dialogue in this way, they inevitably begin to examine not only external ideas, but their own conduct as well. This is where Socratic teaching directly intersects with ethics. For Socrates, ethics is not a set of external rules. It is the direct result of self-knowledge. He starts from a simple and radical idea. No one does evil consciously. When someone acts wrongly, they act out of ignorance. Ignorance about what is good, about themselves, about the consequences of their own actions. From this comes the inseparable link between virtue and knowledge. To be virtuous is not to obey out of fear, but to rationally understand why a certain action is just. Reason guides behavior. Those who know the good tend to practice it. That is why Socrates does not teach morality as commandment, but as a constant investigation of one's own conduct. This thought directly confronts Athenian culture, which associated virtue with prestige, tradition, or power. Socrates shifts everything inward, to the individual. The question ceases to be, what do others approve of, and becomes, what is true and just. This internal examination is demanding, uncomfortable, and permanent. Socratic ethics is born from the habit of questioning oneself, thinking well in order to live well, and when life begins to be examined in this way, the next step is inevitable: to use this same critical criterion to investigate all ideas. This is how ethics connects directly to the search for truth. For Socrates, critical thinking is not about distrusting everything out of suspicion, but about examining everything through reason. Truth does not reveal itself to those who accept ideas based on tradition, authority, or majority opinion. It requires analysis, coherence, and a willingness to revise beliefs. Thinking here is an active and continuous exercise. Socrates teaches that untested opinions are dangerous. They seem harmless, but they shape decisions, laws, and behaviors. That is why he insists on questioning. What do you mean by this? Does this apply in all cases? Isn't there a contradiction here? Each question functions like a filter, separating appearance from real knowledge. This process is uncomfortable because it dismantles social certainties. Many truths survive only because they have never been examined. By applying the critical method, Socrates reveals how fragile our convictions are. But this fragility is not a problem. It is the starting point for better thinking. The search for truth, then, is not about reaching a final answer, but about keeping the mind alert. It is this habit that sustains classical philosophy and prepares the ground for a type of teaching that does not depend on texts or dogmas. A teaching that lives only as long as it is practiced. Socrates never wrote books, not a single line, no treatises, no signed scrolls. And this was not negligence, it was a choice. For him, living knowledge is born in the encounter between people, not in fixed texts. Writing freezes ideas, dialogue keeps them in motion. In ancient Athens, this was unusual. Other thinkers recorded theories, definitions, systems. Socrates does the opposite. He trusts oral teaching, because only in conversation is it possible to adapt questions, correct reasoning, and follow thought in real time. Reason exercises itself better when it is challenged, not when it is memorized. This absence of writings also prevents dogmatic authority. No one can cite Socrates as a final rule. What exists are ideas in circulation, always open to questioning. This forces critical thinking and avoids the false sense of mastering the truth. Everything we know about him comes from his disciples, especially from someone who transforms these conversations into systematic philosophy. It is at this point that Socratic influence ceases to be purely oral and begins to take written form through a decisive name. Socrates' influence on Plato begins through direct contact, daily coexistence, constant dialogue. Plato does not learn through formal classes, but by observing Socrates question everything: politics, morality, knowledge, truth. The impact lies not only in the ideas, but in the intellectual posture. Plato absorbs the Socratic method as the foundation of philosophical thinking. Instead of long, close speeches, he preserves questioning as the engine of reasoning. His future works will maintain this format precisely because dialogue reflects reason in motion better than any rigid treatise. Socrates also influences Plato by showing that philosophy is not a technique of persuasion, but an honest search for truth. The critique of false wisdom, the defense of intellectual humility, and the centrality of self-knowledge become pillars of Platonic thought. Even when Plato develops his own ideas, the Socratic spirit remains. In this way, Socrates' oral teaching gains continuity. Plato becomes the link between the living conversation of the streets of Athens and the systematization of classical philosophy. Thought born in dialogue is now ready to cross generations and shape the entire philosophical tradition that follows. Socrates' legacy does not lie in closed theories, but in a way of thinking that spans centuries. He shifts the axis of Greek philosophy. Before him, the focus was the cosmos. After him, it becomes the human being. What is good? What is justice? What does it mean to live well? These questions become central to classical philosophy. By placing questioning above answers, Socrates establishes the foundation of Western critical thinking. Thinking ceases to be the repetition of traditions and becomes the examination of arguments. Reason becomes the criterion. Truth no longer depends on authority. This directly influences Plato, Aristotle, and the entire subsequent structure of European thought. Another decisive point is the link between knowledge and ethics. Socrates teaches that knowledge is not neutral. To think well implies acting well. This idea shapes moral, political, and educational debates for centuries. Philosophy ceases to be distant speculation and begins to guide practical life. Even without writings, his oral teaching creates a living tradition. Universities, pedagogical methods, and philosophical debates still reproduce Socratic logic: to ask, to analyze, to revise. The legacy is not a system, it is an intellectual habit. And when this habit takes root, it inevitably leads to even deeper reflection on reason, knowledge, and human consciousness itself. For Socrates, reason is what distinguishes living automatically from living consciously. Human beings are not born wise. They become wise by examining what they think, say, and do. Knowledge is not about accumulating information, but about understanding one's own motives, limits, and contradictions. That is where human consciousness emerges. Socrates understands the mind as something active. Thinking is dialoguing with oneself. When reason is not used, a person acts out of habit, fear, or social pressure. When it is used, self-knowledge is born, and this constant internal examination creates responsibility. Those who understand why they act are accountable for their actions. That is why reason and ethics walk together. This view breaks with the idea of destiny or absolute authority. The individual becomes responsible for their own thinking. Consciousness is not passive. It is built through continuous questioning. Thinking well requires intellectual vigilance and a willingness to correct mistakes. There is no comfort in this. There is clarity. By uniting reason, knowledge, and consciousness, Socrates establishes a model of the reflective human being, not guided by impulses, but by rational examination. This model spans centuries and prepares the final question. If this way of thinking emerged more than 2,000 years ago, why does it still make so much sense today? Socrates remains relevant because the problem he faced still exists. People having opinions about everything, too much certainty, too little reflection. In a fast, noisy world full of ready-made answers, the Socratic method works as an intellectual brake. It teaches us to stop, question, and think before agreeing. Conscious ignorance is more necessary than ever. Admitting limits has become a sign of weakness, when in fact it is the foundation of intellectual humility. Socrates reminds us that repeating ideas without examining them is not knowledge. It is habit. And habit does not produce truth. It produces conformity. His focus on dialogue also remains essential. Conversing to understand, not to win. Questioning to clarify, not to humiliate. This model sustains critical thinking, improves public debates, ethical decisions, and even personal relationships. Thinking well continues to be a condition for living well. Without technology, without books, without a stage, Socrates built one of the pillars of classical philosophy using only reason and honest questions. And perhaps that is why he still unsettles us, because he forces each of us to do something difficult. Examine our own consciousness before pointing to that of others. The death of Socrates echoes strongly because the conflict that killed him still exists. In ancient Athens, questioning authorities was seen as a threat. Today, the change of setting has not changed the problem. Those who challenge certainties, expose contradictions, and demand reason still disturb others. The difference is the stage. Before, the public square. Now, social media, schools, public debates. Socrates was condemned not for lying, but for asking too many questions. And this sounds familiar. In a world of fast opinions, likes, and ready-made speeches, critical thinking remains uncomfortable. Questioning dominant narratives still generates rejection. The lesson is clear. Truth rarely pleases when it dismantles conveniences. By accepting the sentence, Socrates teaches something radically current. Coherence matters more than comfort. He shows that ethics is not a discourse adaptable to the situation. It is a commitment to principles. Today, when the pressure for acceptance is constant, his stance reminds us that giving up one's own conscience has a greater cost than facing external consequences. His greatest legacy for the present is the invitation to self-knowledge. Before repeating, examine. Before judging, understand. Before speaking, ask. In times of excess information and scarcity of reflection, conscious ignorance once again becomes strength, not weakness. Socrates died more than 2,000 years ago, but the question he left behind remains alive. Do you prefer to live comfortably without thinking, or to think even if it is uncomfortable? Socrates left no books, no wealth, and sought no fame. What he left was something far more difficult to face, the obligation to think. His life and his death show that questioning has never been comfortable, but it has always been necessary. In a world that prefers quick answers, he reminds us that true wisdom begins when we have the courage to admit that we still do not know. And remember, this channel is free and only exists because of people like you, who believe in sharing strength and motivation. If this message spoke to you, subscribe and share.